Okay, so we would get started now. And today's session is more or less the same like Redux related sessions, but it would be the implementation of Redux in our task manager project. Also, we'd be learning one other library, which is called React Redux. So let me just create the day 5 folder. And I would first revise whatever we have done in the previous session so that we get a refresher. And then we'd go with our task manager project altogether. Also copy this PPT. And I would also copy the task manager project alongside of the documentation over here. All right. Let me just, oh, actually, let me clone it from GitHub rather than copying. I don't know, maybe I might have done some updates in there. So let me just clone it from GitHub. All right, this is the latest code that we have for our task manager project. And we would be like, once I am done with today's session, I would also be pushing today's code into this particular GitHub repo. So you'd have that repository alongside the code as well. So let's also do yarn. That would basically get every dependency installed. And then I'll also do yarn start. Once every dependency is installed, I'll go for the yarn start as well. And just to refresh what we meant by React and Redux working together is that the view basically would dispatch an action. The action would invoke a reducer. The reducer gives you a new store, and that new store is reflected back to the view. So that is the process that has been going on. And the whole action, store, and reducer combination, that whole setup was Redux. And the view could be anything. In this case, it'll be React. All right. So this is something that we should always keep in mind. Plus, if we also talk about how to code this kind of a flow, or how to code maybe actions and reducer and all. So actions are JavaScript objects with a type property, and they may or may not have payload. Reducers are pure functions that take in two arguments, state and action. State is the current global state. Action is the dispatched action. And based on the action type, reducer returns a new state. Remember, it doesn't modify any state, but it returns a new state. Here's an example of a reducer. And store is this global application state. We can create store by the redux.createStore method, after which it gives us three methods: get, state, dispatch, and subscribe. And notice that there is no set state as far as Redux is concerned. A component can only dispatch an action to set the state. And then there is combined reducer. We saw combined reducer in yesterday's, or the day before yesterday's session. Today we'd be also using combined reducer right away, though there'll be only one reducer that would be there, but potentially there could be multiple reducers in our application. Apply middleware, probably we might not be going for it today, but when we do the Redux Saga implementation, we'd have the apply middleware function created as well. And then we also saw that action generators, like instead of creating just action objects, we'd be going for action generators that are functions that return us action objects. We saw what are pure functions. We saw a couple of examples. And in today's session, we are going for the task manager Redux implementation. All right, we'll be implementing Redux in the task manager. And here we'd be using one more library, which is called Redux Saga. Oh, not Redux Saga, actually. React Redux. Redux Saga would be later. So React Redux is a library that allows you to do a couple of things. One is that if you would have noticed in our existing task manager project, we have actually created the store inside the index, and we have passed that store down as a property to the app component, and then the app component passes it down further to the counter component. which it's basically prop drilling. So if I, for example, check this particular index.js out, you may imagine that I'll be importing the store in here, passing it into the app, and then the app would be passing it into the task manager component. The task manager then would be passing into its own children. So that is something that we are trying to avoid, and React Redux is a library that would help us to avoid that prop drilling, where we pass a prop from the parent to the child and so on and so forth. So in order to avoid that, React Redux gives us a class, or you may say a component called provider, which would provide the store to the whole application. So you don't have to keep on passing and passing and passing props down to the components. It is just this provider that you'd have to use in the main file, and your whole application would have the store available. And whichever component wants to use the store, uh, the component has to call a method called connect method. And this whole provider and connect combination is something that works on the top of an API in Redux itself called the context API. So same thing, like we create a store at a global context, and then we just provide that context down to the component, and each and every component would have to basically use the context by the connect method. So there is one context API that is available in React, which is what React Redux is using. All right, but I'm not going more into the theory portion of the context API itself, but you can check it out. Like React documentation itself has a context API section. For a very long time, it was in the beta version, but now lately it is used properly in Redux. Now it is more of a valid, a stable version essentially. But React Redux have been using context API since quite long. But anyways, we are just implementing context API. We don't need to know the theory of it as such. So then there are two concepts that we would like to also learn today. One is map state to props, and one is map dispatch to props. All right, so state is basically the global state, and dispatch is store.dispatch. So we'll see what this map state to props and map dispatch to prop is. All right, so we'll see what that is. And I'd also like you to read the context API documentation. Let me just open that up. So this is the React context, and there is also certain things, like you can see that context.provider is there. So more or less it is the same that we are going to implement, but it is this particular block could be regarded as the theory portion of the context API. So I would like you to go ahead and read this one whenever you find time. All right, and see if you have any questions. If you do have any questions, you can ask them in the next session that we have. All right, so React Redux is what we are going to use additional to Redux in our task manager project. And we'd be going for this provider, which would provide the store to all the components, and connect, which would be used to connect a component to a Redux store. We'll see how these are used. And then two more concepts, mapping the state to props and mapping the dispatch to props, is what we'd also like to go for. And the agenda is simple. We want to have Redux implementation done in our task manager project with React Redux library. All right. So I believe everyone is clear on the agenda for today and what are we going to learn and all. Yes. Very good. What about other participants? And also make sure that you're clear on the revision that I did about React and Redux combination, because that is something which is very important. You would be you'd be getting you'd be using it a lot in all your projects. All right. So I believe now we can get started with the task manager, I guess. Yep, it's all created. I'll open it up in my editor. I already opened it up. I guess I can just do a yarn start. That'll start up my server. Let's wait for the server to get started. And also, meanwhile, let us have a look at the diagram that we are looking to implement. So you see that earlier our task manager looked something like this. I think I may have to reduce the font size. Let me just do that. All right. So earlier our task manager looked something like this, where the whole business logic was, you know, taken into the component that is the top level component, and then it was passed on methods as well as properties to the bottom components, which was proving to be difficult with the discussion that we had. When the component hierarchy grows, it'll be really not maintainable. So we try to bifurcate diagrammatically, we try to bifurcate the view and the model, where model would contain so many other things, but primarily right now it would have Redux, and the view would be the set of components. Any component that wants to use the model can get connected to the model and use the component or use the data inside the component. So this is the diagram that we want to achieve right now. Currently it looks something like this on your left, and now we'd like to achieve this kind of a feature. All right, so I believe everyone is clear on what we want to achieve here, right? I would like to have a confirmation from all that everyone is clear on what we would like to achieve as far as this whole implementation is concerned. So by the diagram itself, it shows that eventually these properties from the task manager and this these methods from the task manager, they would go, and they would be inside the Redux as state and actions. All right. So that's basically what we are trying to achieve in this particular case. All right. So let's see. Right now we have this login screen. We may want to change that. When we implement routing, there will be a login route created. As of now, I'll just comment things out as I did earlier. All right, I'll just have the task manager uncommented, and as soon as we save it, you see that you have the task manager over here. All right, and this is the add and all. It is working. Delete we have not implemented yet, so delete would not be working, but the add is working. But we know that add is pretty much of a drag right now, because the state is there in the task manager component, the state is passed in the task list. The add function, again, it is passed in the task form, and then when the task form submits in the handle submit event, when everything is valid, we go for this .props.add task, which is then taken to the task manager, which changes the state, the component re-renders, and the task list gets a fresh set of tasks, and it renders the tasks. So you can see that this itself, it's confusing right now. All right, but we would like to make it less confusing as far as Redux implementation is concerned. So we'd start implementing Redux in here. So we do have our view ready. Our view is already in place. So what do you think would the next step be after the view is created? What should be the next step that we should be taking in this particular case? Actions. Very good, Rita. I believe everyone would agree with Rita on this. We'd go for actions. And as you can just do any particular layer. Like you can go for actions, you can go for reducers, you can create the store. But for a while, we'll just follow this whole approach up till we get good enough practice, and then you can follow whichever approach that you want. So once the view is done, actions would be created, and I'll name this task actions.js. And it's a good idea if we go for action types as a separate variable itself, rather than constants like we did earlier. So if I can create something like a config folder in which I'd create a file called action types.js, I can create constants in here and export those constants, and then import those constants everywhere where I need to for the action type representation. And if we go for constants rather than string literals, it would actually be a good practice avoiding typographical errors later down the line. So if I go for like export const, what are the actions that will be there in this particular case for now? Anyone? What are the action types that we are trying to go for these two for the functionalities that we want to go for? Add and delete. List might not be the action type right now. We would like to go for listing as an action type later. As of now, we'll just go with add task, and list would just happen by fetching the data from the tasks itself. So as of now, add task is one constant and delete task is another. List would come when we want to go for the API calls and all. So at that point, we'll come back to this action types.js. And the whole aim of action types created as constants is so that we can avoid typo errors. And if there are any errors, we just see it compile time rather than run time. All right. So now we import those from import from actions slash, oh, not actions actually, config slash action types, and I'll be importing add task and delete task from there. All right, and then we would like to also go for the action generators. So we'd not be creating action objects, but we'd be creating functions that would return us action objects. So export const add task action would be a function, and this function, it takes in data. Now this data is something that we are expecting from the task form itself. So if I just want to define data would be simply title and description. All right, two properties. So add task action would return the type to be add task and data as the payload. So again, I'm using the ES6 property, where if I go for data is equal to data, like data colon data would be also fine. But in order to avoid repetition, when the key and the value both are the same identifier, we can choose to use any one of them, which would mean the same thing. That is an ES6 shorthand notation for the key values in an object. So this is our add task action. Export const delete task action. Now, what do you think would be the argument that we would be getting inside the delete task action? Anyone? Any ideas? Okay, ID. ID, very good. So we'd go for ID in here. That is our payload. So return type delete task, and the payload is ID. All right, ID is the task ID. So these are the two actions that we want to start with. And remember, there'll be other actions that will be coming along, and we'll see how things will go later down the line. For today though, only two actions. So these actions, I believe they're clear for all, right? And I'd also like to know from you all that what would be the next step in this particular process. Reducer, very good, Rita. So I believe reducers is something that everyone agrees with. Palak also mentions reducers, so thank you. So reducers, yes. So we would go for reducers, and we would go for a new file, we'll call it task reducer.js, and we would import the actions from, or the action types from the config, so that we can do that switch case kind of a thing. All right, and we'd go with add task and remove task. Oh, it was delete task, I guess. And by the way, I have named this folder config, but you can name it anything. This would basically, what I need is this would contain all the configuration settings for this particular project. That's how I want to get it created. But you can name this one anything that you want. Maybe helpers or something like that would be fine as well. All right, so add task, delete task, and our reducer, it's a pure function. So export, and we'd have to export it, of course, because we'd have to import it somewhere else. So export const task reducer state and action. Now, first of all, I have to decide what would be the initial state. Now remember, this is a task reducer, meaning represents the list of tasks. So if that is the case, what would be the initial value of the state if it is the representation of list of tasks? Jignesh says blank object, Rita says model. Remember, it's a list of tasks, everyone. there will be object, there will be model, but it is a list of tasks, not a single task. Jinesh has the correct answer. It's a blank array, right? I believe everyone agrees with Jinesh on this. Should be a blank array, and then there will be objects, yes, but this should be a blank array. I would like to have a confirmation from all that this is clear. All right. What about other participants? Okay. All right. Very good. And it is always a good idea to create the initial state in a separate variable and assign it to the state. This would be really handy in some other cases. I will form this habit all the time. All right. This is a good practice. So initial state, and then there will be switch action dot type and case add task, and there will be another case delete task. Will be putting in the code in there as well. Default, it will return us state. All right. So this is the initial structure. Now, as far as add task is concerned, we'll do something similar to what we did inside the task manager. So let's just recall what we did in the task manager. We first created a task like this dot state dot task dot length plus one, that is the ID, and then the data dot title and data dot description. So this is what we'd be doing. And then what we did was we spread through the current list of tasks, and then we added the new task at the end. So this is something similar to what we'd be doing inside the task reducer. So the task reducer goes like this. I'd first create a new task. So const task is equal to, and then again I'd have to import the model. So let's do that. Import task from task. So it'll be like new task and then state dot length plus one. Now we can imagine that if, for example, the initial state is blank, which means state dot length is 0, plus 1 would be 1. So your first task would have the ID 1, and then 2, and then 3, and so on and so forth. And the second argument would be the data dot title and data dot description. Now we do have data as a payload when it comes to add task as the action type. So when the type is add task, the payload is data. Data should have title and description because we are going to dispatch this action from the task form. So what we would do is const data is equal to action. We are extracting data from the action. This is the destructuring syntax, and then it'll be like data dot title and data dot description. All right, and then I just return whatever the current state contains plus the task that we want to have. So here, remember, we are not modifying the current state. We're just spreading through the current state and then adding a new task at the end, and we are returning that new array. There's no modification of the state here. It is, let's say if the state has 3 tasks, this state variable would remain the same, but this reducer would return you a new state altogether. All right. So I believe this add task that we did, almost the same as the set state for the task manager. I believe this is clear to all. Very good. Very good. What about other participants? Okay. And then I would go for a delete task as well. And I'll just do this. Return state dot filter. It'll give me a task, and I'll return the ID, because if I go for like delete task as the action type, the payload is the ID. I'm extracting that from action, and we go with like if task dot ID not equal to ID, and I'm returning this. All right. So I would explain this filter in a while, but before that, I want to know that if anyone already knows what is happening over here. Can anyone just let me know what could the explanation of this be? Veteran JavaScript programmers would know what filter is. it ignores the task that matches the ID. Very good, Rita. So basically a filter function, who here doesn't know what a filter function does? Can everyone just revert on that, please? Who is not aware of the filter function? All right, let me explain what it is. It is actually something related to ES5, that is the old JavaScript. And ES5 has this array dot length as a property. I will also explain one of the other functions, which is for each, which would help us in learning the filter. And then there are so many others like map we already seen. All right, so we'll see what this filter is, which will be helpful later down the line. All right, so if for example we talk about the for each, and this is pure JavaScript, so I can just do in the console of my browser, that will also be fine. So if we talk about an array, for example, const marks is equal to 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. All right, if I go for marks dot for each, oh, we already seen this, right? Marks dot for each, where we can simply loop through the marks, and console.log marks can be looped through like m. All right, and at the end for each returns undefined. We have seen this for each implementation while we went for the map function implementation. We all know that for each returns undefined. But what about if we talk about marks.filter? All right, and if I hit enter, you can see that filter doesn't return us undefined, but it returns us an array. And the array is basically the dependent the array elements are dependent on the return value of this callback function. So if for example the callback function returns true, all right, every element would be included, because every iteration would return us true, all the elements would be imported included in all. But if it returns false, no elements would be included. So say if we are having this marks array with us, which is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and we want to just return the marks that are greater than 30. So what do you think would be the expression that I would write in here? True false has to be dynamic. So what do you think would be the expression that I should write so that the marks which are greater than 30 would be included in the result? All right. Okay. So Rita says we can go with m greater than 30. I believe everyone agrees with Rita on this. Yes, everyone understands where m greater than 30 would give us only 40 and 50. I'd like to have a confirmation from all. All right, very good. And this, by the way, doesn't modify the original array. So marks would still be as it is. And that's the reason why I'm using filter over here. The filter function itself doesn't modify the state, but it returns us a new array, which basically would be the array which would not have the ID that is matched. So task ID not equal to ID, whenever it'll return true, and all the elements would be there. But whenever the task ID is equal to ID, it will return false, and that specific task would not be included. All right. So I believe all of you now get what this filter function does in here. Plus it returns us a new array. All right. So please confirm. All right. Very good. So this is our reducer, and we have taken due care that it doesn't modify the current state, but it returns us a new state. And by default, whenever no actions type match, at that point, it will return whatever the current state is. All right, but it will not do anything to the current state. That is one thing. So this task reducer being done, what is the next step that we should go with? Anyone, any ideas? Palak says store. All right, but if you, Rita also says store, and Ketan as well. So if you recall, there was one thing that we did inside the store, and that is what I would like to do before creating the store. What was that? Like we did create the store right away, but then we did some modification so that we used a combined reducer type of a function. So what type of a reducer that we created before passing it to the store? what do we pass while create store function is called? And there is a special name for that reducer. Nope. Shweta says subscribe. No. Rita says root reducer. Yes, root reducer is the one. So I believe everyone recalls, right? Root reducer is something that we did, but later down the line. Right now, we'd be creating the root reducer right away. So everyone recalls the root reducer kind of a thing that we did. Yes. So I would create the root reducer in here itself inside the reducers. You can also name it index.js. That will also be fine, but I'm just creating it as a root reducer. So I would need the combine reducers function from Redux, and at this point we'd be installing Redux in our application. Up till now we didn't have Redux installed in the application at all, so now we'd be having Redux. But before that, I would still like to reconfirm from all that everyone recalls this root reducer that we created the other day, right? All right, very good. So let's first install Redux in here. I'm not installing React Redux up just yet, because we should know that when exactly these libraries would be required. So Redux is required right here before creating the root reducer. Then also it'll help you to create the store. React Redux would be required once we are done with the store creation. So we'll see. We'll install it at that moment. Let's wait for this to get done. All right. So I would import combined reducers from Redux. And I would also import the task reducer. And I'll create a root reducer. And the shape of the store that I want is, it should be having a tasks property, which would be whatever the task reducer returns. And initially, because we have set it to a blank array, it should be a blank array. So tasks, task reducer, and I would export default root reducer. All right. So combine reducer, task reducer, and we'd be exporting the root reducer by default. So this is what it is. And now we'd be creating the store. I believe everyone is clear on the root reducer, right? Just one confirmation, please. Very good. I'll create the store now as a separate file, store.js. And in the store, I would import create store from Redux. And I would also import the root reducer from reducers slash root reducer. One thing that I would like you to note here is that what I have done is I have created a constant root reducer and I've exported it by default, this root reducer altogether, right? But if I want, I can avoid the whole creation of the variable and I can just go with the root reducer like this, and this would also work. All right, which also tells you that if you do an export default, all right, if you do an export default, you don't have to bother about what name are you providing while you import. You can name this anything. I can name it anything. Even if it was export default root reducer over here, I could have named this import anything that I wanted. All right, so that is also one thing that you should take care of as far as import is concerned. I would keep it this way only. If required, I would change it back to what it was earlier, but this import root reducer would still stay. All right, so that is this export default speciality. Whenever it's a normal export, you'd have to specify exactly the identifier name that has been exported. But in case of export default, you can name it anything that you want. All right, so that is one thing. Now we would like to create a store is equal to create store. I'll pass in the root reducer in here. and I would export default store. Now I have purposefully created the store as a constant variable. I'm doing an export default store, and there is a reason for that. We would come to that once we go for the Redux Saga implementation. So I would be keeping it this way only. This is our store created, but then there will be so many other things coming in inside the store.js file itself. So I believe this store creation also is clear to all. Yes, everyone? Very good. What about other participants? I'd like to have a confirmation from all. All right. Very good. Okay, so store created. Now we'd go into our index.js and we'll be importing our store over here, and we need to provide the store to the app component. But at that point, we'd be using the React Redux library. But let's first import the store and just check out the state of the or shape of the store altogether. So I'll import store from store. And for now, I'll just do a console.log store.getState. And when I do that, and I check out the console of my browser, I should get the store that we are, the store that we are going for. That is tasks and array with 0. All right. So this whole tasks array 0, it is all coming in from the reducer. So basically, if I go to the reducer, the task reducer, it's giving us an initial state to be the blank array, and the root reducer, it is giving us this type of a store, which is an object which has tasks as the key, and the array is whatever the task reducer returns. Also, let's say, for example, if I have a couple of tasks added in here, like for example, new task 1, learn Redux, and new task 2, learn Redux Saga, something like this, then what we would get is the tasks having 2 arrays, learn Redux Saga. The rest of them would be constructed based on what the constructor was. But this, you can already see that this is directly the modification that we are having from the initial state that we have set inside the task reducer. So the whole next problem statement essentially is that I want to display these 2 tasks, that is learn Redux and learn Redux Saga, inside or in place of this list that is coming in from the parent component. So that is my next problem statement. All right. So I believe everyone is clear up till now, and everyone is also aware of what my next problem statement is. Is that correct? Very good. What about other participants? I would like to have a confirmation from all the participants that you're clear. Okay. Others also please revert. Okay. Anyone, any questions up till now? Okay, seems that everyone is clear on this. However, if you have any other questions on this, please let me know. Now, as I said, like we would like to go with the store being provided into the app component, but this time around, we'd not like to pass it down as a property, but we'd be using the provider component from React Redux library. All right. So that provider would make sure that the store is provided to the app component and all its child components. All right. So let's import that from React Redux, but then again, we'd have to install React Redux here. So let me just go for yarn add React Redux. If you don't have yarn, you can go with npm install React Redux. And since Redux is a separate library, React, it's a different library altogether. This type of bridging libraries are necessary as far as React and any other library is concerned. And that's where React Redux comes into the picture. So let's just wait for this to happen. Okay, so React and Redux installed. Oh, sorry, React Redux library itself is installed, and then I would like to import provider from React Redux. And this is how a provider would be used. Provider/provider. The app component goes inside the provider. All right. So now this is what becomes our new main component. And the provider has one property called store. That property has to be store. It is predefined. And that property would have our store as a value. So this would make sure that this store is being provided to the app component and all the other child components that are there inside the app component. So now any other component that wants to use the store, they can just connect to the store using the connect method, and then they can use the values from the store or even dispatch actions if they want to. All right. So this is how you set up the React Redux library for providing the store. You don't have to now pass on, and you don't have to keep on passing the keep on passing the values inside the components. And then Rita asks, so no need for store.subscribe. That's correct, Rita. No need for store.subscribe. But that whole aspect is covered in something called map state to props. Eventually, we'll not need store.subscribe at all. And that is something which is covered by map state to props kind of a functionality, which we'll be covering in a while. All right. So this being done, now we would go into one of the components. And what I want to do is I want to display this particular list of tasks. So which is the component that we should be working on the next? Task list component, very good. So everyone agrees with Rita on this. Task list is the next component that we should start coding in. Yes, everyone? Right, and it'll go as per the diagram. We want from Redux, we want the set of tasks inside the task list. All right, so we would go into the task list component, which is here. And what I would like to do is I would like to connect this task list component to the global Redux store. And in that case, I would import the connect function from React Redux. Right, so it's the provider and connect combination that helps you to get the store in a specific component. So you use provider at the index, and then you use connect wherever you want to do the connection to the store. So these kinds of components which actually are connected to the Redux store, these kinds of components are known as container components, while there are presentational components which are not even connected to the Redux store. They don't even know whether Redux exists or not in our project. All right, so we will come to that presentational and container components in a while once we are done with this whole application altogether. So connect from React Redux can be used this way. Connect, a function call, and this function call returns us another function which then can be called like this. All right, so this connect function returns us another function which takes in the component as the argument. All right, just to be really certain on what I'm trying to say here is, like if I go for like connect function is equal to this connect, and then I use something like connect function over here to pass on the component as the argument. All right, so this is how you connect a component to the Redux store. But the only thing is, like, I'm avoiding using an unnecessary variable, just going for this kind of a connect method, and that's it. All right, so export default connect into the brackets and our component so that we can use certain things from the Redux store. All right, so I believe this usage of connect function is clear to everyone, right? Please confirm. Very good. What about other participants? Like to have a confirmation from all. All right. So now this connect itself would give us some capability of modifying the props of the current component. The only way we can pass any data to a component is through the props that we know already. And this connect method, it allows you to modify the props of the current component, making the component feel that the props are coming in from the parent component, but they're actually coming in from the connect method from the React Redux library. So the first thing that we'd be doing is take the state from the Redux store and map it to the props of the component. I'll call that function map state to props, but you can call the function anything that you want. All right, map state to props. And this function name could be anything. So map state to props returns us an object, and this object can contain any key value pairs that you want, and this object would be basically merged with the props of the current component. So as of now, let's just get rid of everything and let's just keep it the way it was earlier, just to see the difference. All right, so this is your initial set of or initial component that you have. And if I do a console log of props, we know that props is an object which will have one property, that is tasks, and that is tasks array of 6, which is coming in from the task manager. All right, the parent component. And now if I go for connect, you see the difference in the props that would happen just with the usage of connect method. If I use something like this, it takes in a component and returns us the same component, but by modifying the props of the component, you can see that there's already a dispatch function available inside the connect. And if I do something like map state to props, and if I return, let's say something like foo bar, and I put that map state to props inside the connect function as the first argument, there'll be another argument as well passed in soon. So if I put this map state to props as the first argument, you can see that this property, new property, is added to the props of the component altogether. All right, so foo bar is added to the props, and then if I add any number of properties, they would be just merged. All right, so let's say test 1 2 3. If I save it, you can see that test 1 2 3 is also added. So basically, map state to props function, when used as the first argument to the connect method, merges the returned object to the props of the component. So now my question is that if I go for tasks is a blank bracket, all right, a blank array in the sense like an empty array, and if I save it, what do you think should happen to this array? Remember, there is already a tasks property, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to include another tasks property. So what do you think should happen to the existing tasks? Anyone, any ideas? Shubham says it'll update tasks to blank array. Rita says it'll overwrite. Let's see. And there you go. Tasks is now an array of 0 elements. Task array should be merged, right? So basically, tasks array would not be merged, Palak. These objects are merged. So any property that you have would be overridden. All right. So I believe this override that is happening, it is clear to everyone. Yes. I'd like to have a confirmation from everyone here. All right, very good. What about other participants? Just like to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Okay. So we don't need a blank array though. We need something from the state. We don't need these properties as well. So I'll get rid of them. All right. And if we talk about the map state to props, we would already get the state available automatically as the argument to the map state to props when we pass it inside the connect method. So the provider and connect combination works in such a way where the provider throws the state at you, and any function or any component that has the connect function, it just grabs the state right away. through the map state to props function, that is through the first argument. So here I'll get the state. All right, and state, remember, it's an object which has one property called tasks. So if I want that state's property, that is tasks, to be put into this particular tasks, what do you think should I write in here? Okay, Rita says state.getState.tasks. Okay, so one thing that I would also like to mention here is this is the state and not the store. So basically this is already store.getState. All right, this whole state itself is already store.getState. So now you get the whole getState functions output in here. So now what do you think would it be, Rita? State.tasks. Very good, Palak. So it'll be state.tasks, because state is store.getState, that is an object, and then we are getting this task property from there. And now you can see that the tasks is the array of 2 elements, which is coming in from your task reducer itself. So let's say if I have another thing like new task 3, learn Axios. If I do this, you can see that the new task is also added in here. So now the reducer is the one that is controlling the list of tasks in our component. All right, and this being done, can anyone tell me, is this tasks now necessary? Yes or no? This particular property from the parent, is it necessary anymore? All right. All right, not necessary at all. I can get rid of it. Still this would work. Why? Because this time around we're not overriding any property, but we are creating a new property now. All right, so property creation is already something that can be done. All right, so this task list is not required, or task list is required, but the property is not required, and hence the state itself, it's not required. You can get rid of the state altogether. All right, not required at all. So this particular task list component, which is grabbing the state from the Redux store and displaying that state inside the render function, I believe this is first of all clear to everyone. And I would like to have a confirmation from all the participants. All right, very good. So this is something which is an example of map state to props. And now there is also another thing called map dispatch to props that we'll be going for. What I want to now do is I want to make this add form functional. So of course I would go into the task form component, and because here we want to also connect this component to the Redux store, I would import the connect method first. Import connect, oh, of course the brackets, connect from React Redux. All right, and right at the end I would get the connect function done. And this time around we need to dispatch an action. So whenever we want to dispatch an action, we need that dispatch from the store. All right, like the store.getState we had, we also want to have the store.dispatch. So in that case we go for something called map dispatch to props. And the map dispatch to props again does the same thing as map state to props does. It returns as an object. Let's say this time around I want to override the add task property. All right, so I can override the add task property in here, and this property itself is a function, so I'll keep it as a function. And for now I'll just do a console log inside add tasks, or add task, yeah, inside add task, something like this. And if it is a map dispatch to props, we pass it in as the second argument. So first will be null, and map dispatch to props second argument. The reason why I do it as a second argument is that I want this dispatch function available inside map dispatch to props. Dispatch would be available, which will be basically store.dispatch. All right, and then we can dispatch actions in here. So if we go for map dispatch to props, or any function, in short, if it is a second argument, you'd get dispatch as the argument to that function, which you can use later to dispatch actions. And because of that, I'm naming it map dispatch to props. Otherwise you can name it anything that you want to. It's also okay if you just pass in this whole function directly instead of this variable, but that'll be not readable. So we'll just keep it this way. So what we're doing with this map dispatch to props is that we are, oh, let me just do one more thing here. Let me just get rid of the console log props. This is distracting us, all right, from the task list, and I'll get rid of the task list as well. So with the map dispatch to props, this add task function is overridden, and we get this console log add task. Now, if I hit add, yep, I have to put in some data. If I hit add, you see that it is in the still in the task form.jsx line number 88 inside the add task. And if you also see the definition of add task in here, or maybe the calling of add task, it takes in one argument as data. I can take in that data as an argument, and I can just pass it inside the console log. So what would now happen is that if I go for test 1, 2, 3, you see inside add task and console log happening. So basically whatever there was inside the task manager, this property add task, we are overriding it inside the map dispatch to props as an add task property itself. But this time around, the add task is a function that we want to call in. All right. So here, instead of console log, I want to do one thing from these particular actions, which is the add task action dispatch, which takes in the data. So I would definitely have to import that action right at the top. Let me just do that. Import add task action from actions, task actions, and I would just simply dispatch, instead of doing a console log, dispatch add task action. It takes in data as an argument. All right. So as soon as I dispatch add task action over here, this add task is obviously overridden, and clicking on submit when everything is valid, it'll go for this.props.add task. This time around, it will not call the add task function from the parent, but it will call this add task function, which is the part of map dispatch to props. And here we are dispatching the add task action. The add task action is returning us this particular action with the type add task and the data as a payload. Data is basically title and description as properties. And because the action is dispatched, the reducer would automatically be invoked. And in that, this case would match, where we are grabbing the data from the action and we are creating a new task. And at the end, we are returning everything that the current state has, plus the new task that is created. And we have not done store.subscribe yet, but because the task list is already mapped to the state, this store.subscribe is taken care of automatically inside the connect function. All right, so we don't have to do store.subscribe. Hopefully, if everything works correctly, we should get the data added to the list of tasks. So let's see. I go with learn unit testing. All right, you can see that the data gets added to the list of tasks. That is all because of this map dispatch to props. All right, so with this done, do you think that the add task property is necessary? All right, very good. Rita also has another question. I'll come back to that. And Rita has an answer to this question as well. So is this add task property in the task manager necessary, everyone? All right. Rita and Janesh say no. And that's fine. I mean, we don't have to have it because the task form is already adding this particular property and we don't need that parent component property. So basically this would not be needed. All right. This add task function on the task manager is not required, and this model is not required. So what do you think about this class component now? Should we keep it as a class component? Is it required for this to be a class component now, or what should we do? Okay, very good. Functional component is what Rita says, and I believe everyone would agree with her that it should be a functional component now. Yes, everyone? All right, very good. Shweta also says the same. So I'll take off the component. I'll go for const task manager. Task manager would take in props. and there will be no render function at all, and it'll be a simple functional component that just displays the data. That's it. Just presents the data. Doesn't even know that Redux is there. All right, and still everything would be working. You can see that the data is not persistent. When I refresh my browser, the data goes, and that is still understandable because there's no API call done. There's no persistence at this point that we can establish. Redux, again, it's just a variable on the browser. So on the refresh, everything would be reset. All right. But this type of a component, which is just used to present the data, and it doesn't even know whether there is something called Redux inside our system or not. These are called presentational components. And the components that actually know Redux is there, they are connected to Redux. These are called as container components. All right. So container components and presentational components, both of them would be there. And Rita also has a question that is it compulsory to use null as the first argument in the connect function? Well, when it is map dispatch to props, map dispatch to props has to be passed as the second argument, because then and only then we'd get this dispatch available as an argument to the map dispatch to props. And at that point, because we don't need any map state to props in the task form, because there's no usage of state at all inside the task form, we would pass this as null. It could also be possible, and you would see inside the task list that at some point there will be both map state to props and map dispatch to props. But as of now, in the task form, we don't need map state to props, and hence we are just putting in null instead of that. All right, Rita? Okay, so this being done, I believe everyone is clear with the map dispatch to props and how we are overriding or we are adding an add task property, and also the difference between a presentational and a container component. Yes, everyone? I'd like to have a confirmation from all so that we can move forward. Okay, very good. What about other participants? Please confirm. Just like to make sure that everyone knows what we are doing. All right. So now I want to go for the delete task functionality. So which component do you think should I go for if I want to get the delete task functionality done? Anyone, any suggestions? Task list is what Palak says. The answer to that could be that which component contains the delete button. Does task list contain the delete button? Task item, very good, Jinesh. So yes, the task item contains the delete button, which is this one, on the click of which we would like to dispatch an action, that is the delete task action. All right. So, so I would like to first use the connect method, and this task item would be connected to the store. Let's do that. Import connect from React Redux, and I do something like connect. All right. So when we do this, the task item would be connected, and now I would like to know from you that do I need a map state to props in here, or do I need a map dispatch to props? Map dispatch to props. Very good, Rita. So I believe everyone would agree with Rita, because here we want to dispatch an action. Map dispatch is what is necessary. We're already getting the task from the parent component. Uh, Basically, the parent component, the task list itself, is passing a task as a property. So we don't need to go for map state to props essentially. But because we want to dispatch an action on the delete button, we go for map dispatch to props. All right. So map dispatch to props. We'll take the dispatch from the state and it'll return delete task as a function, which we can call. This delete task would take in an ID, all right, and it'll dispatch the delete task action. All right, I think it'll not auto populate, so I'd have to import it manually. So I'd import delete task action from, have to go a level or a couple of more levels up, actions, task actions. And of course, I'll pass it in as the second argument. Map dispatch to props always goes in as a second argument. All right. And on the click of this button, we can do something like handle delete. All right. And we can create handle delete here, which would basically go for props.delete task. And I'll pass in the task.id. All right. So here it's a delete handler like the handle submit we made. On click handle delete would happen, and the handle delete would call the props.delete task with the task ID. You can also keep this callback function or this anonymous function right away inside the on click. That is also a good way to go for it. But I prefer this particular handler function concept, which makes it really readable on what is happening. All right. So when this happens, you can see that the tasks are getting deleted, the tasks are getting added. All right. And this whole add and delete is working perfectly. All right. So if I just want to explain it once again on what is the flow of the data, it is when the handle delete happens, on click of this button, we get the current task's ID passed on to the delete task method from the props. We're not getting any from the props, by the way, but we are having it in the map dispatch to props, taking in the ID and dispatching the delete task action with the ID. Now the delete task action is basically of the type delete task, and the payload is the ID. And the reducer also has the case related to this. So when the action gets dispatched, the reducer automatically gets invoked, and this case is what is executed. It has the ID extracted from the action, and a state.filter is done. We know that state.filter would simply give you a new state which doesn't have the current ID based on this condition. So whenever a new state is obtained, the task list is already mapped to the state, so we don't need to do a subscribe, but the task list is expected to reload automatically. And that is exactly what is happening. So if I delete, say for example, learn Redux Saga, the whole process would happen and the task list would reload because of this map state to props, and we'd get the updated list of tasks. So that whole thing happens. And at the end, if there are no tasks, I'll just show you no tasks to show. All right. So I believe the flow is okay. Before that, Shubham has a question. How action get the action ID? We haven't passed it on click. So if you check here, Shubham, on click, we're going for handle delete, and handle delete is calling the prop.delete task with the task ID, and that ID has been taken inside the delete task, and in the delete task action, we are passing it as an argument. So that is then taken in as the payload inside of this delete task action. So we are indeed passing it inside the handle delete method. All right. Okay. So I believe everyone gets the flow of this whole delete and add and list tasks that we have. And we eventually have done it something like this, which is less confusing. Just that a bit of process is involved, but once you are through with it, once you practice, you get the whole process. Is it capable of calling functions which are outside other functions? Uh, Meaning, I mean, if you can give me an example, Rita, because I don't get what you're saying. If you can restate it. Let's say if we talk about delete task, okay? Okay, props.delete task. So you mean that if props.delete task is capable of calling other functions outside this particular function, is that correct? Like if there is a function like this, would the delete task function be able to call this test function? Is that what you're saying? Okay, then you would have to explain it. You can unmute yourself and you can explain what you're trying to say.
Hello.
Yes, Rita.
Actually, my question is regarding, as the Shubham says that where when we are using the prop.delete task, it
Mhm.
automatically calls the delete task under the map dispatch dot props.
Mhm.
अपने आप ही वो automatically call कर लेगा ऐसा?
हाँ, क्योंकि this is props.delete task, right? And since we have done map dispatch to props, delete task as a method is already available to the props. And this
Hence, the
is,
props is available to this task item function, and
yes.
it is outside the function. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, so you can imagine this, like, say for example, the connect method would return us a task item, assigning this delete task as a property to the task item. So yes, it is outside the delete task, but eventually this whole task item would be returned in a manner where it would already have this delete task as a method available. So it is not directly calling this particular method, but it is as a result of this connect function that the task item has this delete task, and it's sort of a copy, or you can also say a reference to this particular function altogether. So it's a functional reference that we are calling. So this is not directly calling it, but it is through the connect method that it is happening.
Okay, got it, got it.
All right, very good. So this flow being done, we would like to like to now also discuss one other thing in this particular case, that when you talk about the task manager itself, eventually we want to implement the login functionality. All right, we want to implement the user authentication and all. So if that is the case, then if we talk about the root reducer, apart from tasks as a key, what do you expect should be there in here as an additional key? Anyone, any ideas? Because we want the login and authentication of the user going on. So login reducer, okay. Login reducer is a pretty specific one, but we can go with something called user reducer, and we can have something called user in here. So like, say for example, if you're talking about some backend programming language like PHP or anything like that, PHP or ASP.NET, you store the user inside a session. And similarly, what we also want to do here is we want to store the user inside Redux, so that later on we can modify the UI, let's say display a logout button or something like that, based on whether the user is there or not. All right, so we would like to go for that user reducer kind of an architecture, but as of now, I'll just keep it this way. So what I'm doing here is I'm having user to be a reducer function and declaring the reducer function right here, and the reducer function returns null. All right, so I'm doing just because I want this user to be uh, null to start with, and then the user would change based on whether the user logged in successfully or not. So I want the user, and hence I'm keeping this placeholder for a while. But this would make our store look like this. Let's say if I go with store.getState, and if I do a console.log store.getState, you'd see that the tasks array is an array of 3 elements and the user is null. That is what we would have. All right, so just keep that in mind, that we want the user to be null or to be a user object later down the line, and hence I'm going for this placeholder for a while. But then we would have all the actions and all the reducers and everything inside this particular user that is there. All right, so I believe this line, it's clear to you. And one thing, that if I do this kind of a thing like user is null, if I do this, this would not reflect at all, because the combined reducer function expects this to be a function and not anything else, and then and only then the key would be populated. All right, so keep that in mind as well. This has to be a function, like the task reducer is a function. This has to be a function as well, but we keep it separately inside its own reducer later down the line when the user is actually implemented. So I would like to know from all that this line that I added, line number 7, the reason for adding this and the usage, it's all clear to all? So Palak says that in a project, if we add all the state inside the store? Is it a lot of data that we have? Yes. So we should be really what do we say, we should be really thoughtful on what should we be adding and what not. Like for example, the task reducer, later on we might not add all the tasks in here. We might go for something called something like pagination or something like that. So that kind of a thing has to be there. It should not be all the data inside the reducer, but it should be very like only the data that is necessary for the UI. So let's say for example, in one UI state we simply would show, let's say, 5 tasks, and the other tasks would be paginated. So those 5 tasks are enough to be added inside the state of Redux essentially. So only the things that are necessary for UI to be displayed, that is something that we'd be adding inside the store, and not everything. All right, I believe that makes sense, Palak. All right. So the last topic that I want to cover today, it's the usage of a middleware, and it is a pretty handy one, which is called Redux Logger. More than this library itself, I want to show you how a middleware can be used inside Redux, and that will be done while creating a store. Redux Logger, by the way, it is a logging library. Like whatever the changes in the state happen, they are logged onto the console through Redux Logger. So I would like to just implement that, and maybe I would take it off as well if it distracts us so much. But the main aim of this small exercise is to let you know how to use a middleware inside Redux. All right. And also, if we talk about a middleware, it's a kind of a library that would have that would be working in the middle of two processes. So every request, every action dispatch, and every store change goes through Redux Logger, and Redux Logger logs it on the console. So that is basically what Logger is essentially. So I would like to go for this Redux Logger as a library. Let me just install it. And the main aim of this whole exercise is to just let you know how to use the apply middleware function from Redux. All right. So let's just wait for this to get completed. Okay. And we would now like to go with something like this: apply middleware from Redux to be imported. And the second argument of create store could be apply middleware. And the apply middleware would have a list of middlewares. Like Redux Saga would also be a middleware that we'd be applying. As of now, it is just logger from Redux Logger that we're applying in here. All right. So now what happens is, since this middleware is running all the time, any action dispatch that would happen would always go through this middleware. So which means, let me add a task, and if I hit add, you can see that the action that was dispatched was add task. The previous state was an array of 3 elements. User is null all the time. The action type was add task, and the data was title and description. And the new state that we have is a state with 4 tasks, the last task being test and 1 to 3. That has been added over here. Similarly, if we go for delete task, for example, you can see if I click, you get the action dispatch delete task. The task previous state was 4 tasks. The delete task with an ID 3 was the action that was dispatched. The next state is 3 tasks with the ID 4 that is in here. So the ID 3 is gone. So this type of a Redux logger, it's always helpful to track down what type of actions are dispatched and what is the state change that is happening. All right. But more importantly, it is the apply middleware function that I wanted you to know. And this is what it looks like. All right. So I believe everyone is also clear on the apply middleware functionality that we have. Yes, everyone? Very good. Very good, guys. So this is what we would have, Redux been implemented as. We'd also like to have the actions and reducers related to the user of this particular system. And we would like to also have the Redux Saga used. But for that, in the next session, we'd be first learning promises. So what are promises and how they work along with the um, API call that we want to do. And there will be a library that will be called Axios that will be learning. Plus, there will be generator functions that we'd also be learning. And what we also need in the next session to do is something like this. We would like to add a library, or maybe a layer, which would look something like this. Let me just make it a bit smaller. All right. So here is our Redux implementation. All right. And we'd also like to add a service layer to our project. This would help us in going for the Redux Saga implementation. So basically what would happen is there will be a task service created. And there is no, this is something that is not defined or any other library. We are just creating a service layer like a task service. That service would be the one that will be responsible for API calls. All right. This will be using something called Axios as well. All right. So that would happen. So the task service for API calls and Axios usage would be done. This would be a promise-based setup that we'd be doing. And we try to involve Redux in calling the service and getting the data onto the task manager to see how that whole thing would go into. And there would also be something called Redux Saga that we'd be later on implementing, which would be working with the service layer. So this is the next thing that we want to do. And we want to basically prepare ourselves for Redux Saga. We would go for something called promises, and then we'd also learn something about generator functions so that we get prepared with Redux Saga in the next session to come. All right, so we, as I said earlier, we'd not be implementing Redux Saga per se, but we'll just learn some bit of it, like some introduction to it, and in the session after the next session we'd be implementing Redux Saga. All right, so promises, generator functions, and service layer is what we are targeting in the next session. I believe everyone is clear with that. And this is basically it for today. And I would like to conclude the session unless anyone has any questions. So if you have any questions, you can put them forward. Else you can just say 0, and hence we can conclude the session. All right. Okay. All right, guys. So this is it for today. I hope everyone gets the whole idea on how Redux and React Redux can be implemented together in any project. The folder structure that we have followed is one of the folder structures of many available online. You can check out other folder structures as well, but simply this one, it's really simple and really works for most of the projects. And mainly the implementation of apply middleware function plus the implementation of map state to props and map dispatch to props is what we were trying to learn in this particular session. So let's call it a day, guys, and let's see you on Monday now. And up till then, have a nice weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.